Sonic gets an idea to plug in a vacuum, with neither him or Tails seeming to realize that the noise from the vacuum would attract robots. They figure out from the design that the vacuum is Porker. Once again, they get insanely lucky. I could buy them finding Tunks. Even justify him not being in the lab anymore because Eggman would have put the transformed friends of Sonic in other places to keep him from finding them. Why would he send them all to the same place? And why would he send them all to Metropolis Zone where he's gonna go to stop the World Roboticizer? He also has the fact that they still look sorta like themselves as appliances for his own sadism's sake backfire. If it weren't for that, Sonic wouldn't recognize anyone shapeshifted. And thinking back to the rat people for a sec, why would Eggman have not deposed their king already? Tails whines about the idea of using Porker as a vacuum because they'd be filling him up with grey powder. So that's nice of him. Sonic calls Porker his best buddy in case he can hear him and tells him he's terribly sorry about this. By another amazing coincidence, Tails predictably finds Johnny the Mop in the same cleanup room. When the last I saw him, he was in the lab. Sonic decides to use the vacuum and thanks Porker and relates that he spent a little time as a toaster to try to cheer him up. He whispers when saying that, which is even better because he doesn't want someone to hear him doing good. It's not about the ego here. Somehow, nobody points out that the sudden disappearance of white powder on the floor where the robots would have remembered going would be just as revealing about where Sonic's been as Sonic leaving footprints in it. They go out the back door, and then tons of arc lights turn on, and camera shutters click open. And they see Eggman in a chair with a megaphone being long-winded and eventually threatening him. He's talking as if he's making a movie long before Sonic Boom. Somehow, Sonic wastes time saying that he's gonna get out of here instead of immediately doing so. He's lucky he didn't get interrupted. They get surrounded by hundreds of robots. And somehow, the narration says that it looks like it's all over, even though they could continuously badnik bounce all over these robots to get to the end of the room. A stinger fires from a buzz bomber and somehow misses Sonic, which I have to assume is because Sonic moved, or else that's stupid. And it hits Porker's switch, knocking it to blow. A big dust cloud creates a smoke screen for Sonic. Naturally, Tails doesn't know where they're supposed to go either. Either way, they escape with Eggman coughing behind them. Tails keeps pointing out that Sonic's only making assumptions about what's good about where he went to because he's smarter than him. They went to a warehouse for robot parts, and Tails hopes they could build their own robots to attack Eggman with them, which not only means he thinks he could build robots despite the writer not knowing to make him a gadgeteer, but also means that he's fine with attacking Eggman. He doesn't specify when he's in the Eggmobile. Sonic calls him little buddy and only turns down his idea because he thinks the control systems in the robots would have them programmed to only do what Eggman wants. Tails should have known that. He says that he wouldn't have this problem if animals were still needed to power robots. Yes, he would. Either way, to have something in it that would make the robot only obey Eggman, or else they wouldn't have been a threat. The vacuum starts rocking. Why is Porker the only one who can move on his own? And only by doing that? It must be a glitch in how vacuums are made with a shapeshifter. Plus, he is the smartest of them all. Sonic and Tails notice the vacuum jumping. They're too busy talking about their ignorance of what their friends were turned into to notice before. Sonic tells Tails to plug him in. I guess he was closer to the plug than him. There's a humorous line, "Tails, I really don't think I know how to talk to vacuum cleaners, even when they're among my best friends." Technically, it doesn't make sense since Sonic's talking to him fine, and his problem is that he doesn't know how to get Porker to talk to him. Tails once again has an idea. He says they should fit the attachment for cleaning stuff. Sonic does so, and a puff of dust emerges. He gets the idea that Porker could write messages in dust, so he decides to try to fill up the vacuum with dust so that it could communicate with him. I never thought this would be how the heroes would find out what their friends were turned into. It's been so long since I've seen good twists in Sonic. The story cuts away to Eggor worrying that there's something wrong with him, only to plan on trying to plan against Sonic to try to please Eggman. Only to find out Sonic and Tails had left Eggman in the dust right after he showed up. And start following them even though he can't run at their speed. That was a big waste of time. That's all the scene is. It took way too many words to describe that. At least it gave him more character because he wanted to be a movie star. It cuts to Sonic unrealistically parroting what Porker had told him about what his friends were turned into. Tails looks forward to playing a console that Joe Sushi was turned into. And the narrator knows to say, despite himself, to make up for him looking callous, just leaving him with wanting to play a video game, because that's relatable. Tails wouldn't be believable if literally all he ever wanted to do and did was go through the levels of the games. Or if literally all he wanted to do was make gadgets, because it's too one-dimensional. Tails had been told to perch on a stack of crates by the entrance so that it could read all of Porker's messages more easily. So that's a good idea of Sonic's. There's a clanking noise from the doorway, and Sonic gets instantly bathed in the ray that once turned him into a toaster. Tails knocks Eggor over. The narration's nice enough to say that Tails could be a professional wrestler. And then Tails reverses the transformation after a brief fake-out where he thought it didn't get reversed. Sonic says, well done. Surprisingly, Porker, Tux, and Johnny also got hit by the reverse ray. Johnny reveals that he's not as optimistic as Porker because he feels awful about how he used to be a broom, even though the neat freak Porker says he's okay, when he used to be forced to vacuum dust up into him. I guess Johnny has more pride than Porker. Eggor stands still in mid-pace instead of continuing to fight Sonic, because he's stuck between following Eggman's programming to serve him and thinking that Sally's cool. Tails is unusually callous but pragmatic here by saying that Sonic should smash him rather than leave and hope he turns good, which is a good thing to hope here because no other robot talks like that. Sonic says no because he instantly convinced himself he's got horrible traps inside him like bombs just because he's Eggman's pet lab robot. By that same logic, why wouldn't Eggman rig all of the robots to self-destruct upon destruction? Not just his assistant. He can make a bunch of bomb-shaped robots. They're referenced in this book. I just have to assume he doesn't have nearly enough of the materials he'd need to make every robot self-destruct. I recently heard about the lore that Eggman owns every casino in the games. By that logic, he would be able to afford having every robot of his self-destruct, and a huge explosion at that. That would be completely series-breaking because Sonic shouldn't be able to survive that. All of the main characters run through the back door, somehow deciding to leave the ruined ray gun behind them. Which is at least ruined apparently, but why would they let him keep it so that he could get it fixed when they already thought he was harmless? Why did it get ruined just because it reversed a bunch of transformations? Eggor has amnesia circuits, even though Eggman couldn't have anticipated that he'd need them. But Eggor can't use them to forget Sally. Somehow. The narration at least thought enough about his book to say that if Sonic had followed Eggor, he would have gone back to Eggman's lab, but he had to get his friends to safety. That's the lame excuse because if you remember AOSCH, Sonic could just pick up his friends, run all the way to safety, and then put him down and go back to where he was in seconds. With the way the franchise is written, I wouldn't even blink if he just picked up all of them at once and ran to safety, because they like to give him super strength when it's convenient. So he could follow Eggor. Then the book reveals that Eggman's made a bunch of movies about Sonic dying that only robots are allowed to see for no reason, even though he'd make money off of normal people buying tickets for them. It's disturbing, but it takes such good advantage of Eggman as a character. You'd think Eggman would have been said to have done this in SAT-AM, or especially Underground. How is it a surprisingly high percentage of these movies that feature hedgehogs dying? If anything, it's surprising that not all of them are like that. When I was reading this book, I actually forgot that Sonic Boom did this. That's because the audience didn't get to see the part where Sonic, as in Knuckles playing Sonic, was getting killed in Eggman's movie. Surprisingly, Sonic put his friends besides Tails at risk by letting them wait around the dark corner near Eggman's cinema until he'd return, with no weapons to protect themselves. I thought Sonic was gonna bring them to his house. He's lucky they didn't get attacked by robots. He goes back to them in no time with a popcorn dispenser that used to be Flicky. Sonic stole a hot dog to eat from the robot ticket collector. So again, it's good that he's trying to enjoy himself. He's asked by Johnny if he's sure that's Flicky. I like that he has a witty response. Either it's Flicky or Robotnik's invented a chirping popcorn dispenser, and to be honest, I don't think he'd bother. At first, Sonic thinks it's a good idea to tell his friends to stay safe by the edge of Metropolis. Tails says Eggman's bound to have robot search crews coming here. Somehow, Sonic doesn't believe him, and tells him to shut up when he tries to contradict him. The narration says he had enough to worry about and that wasn't Tails' fault, so Sonic says sorry and admits that he's too stressed out, and asks if anyone's got better ideas. It cuts ahead to Porker saying he has bad memories about this kind of thing, and the narration says he clanked along. And I have to assume based on the tone that it's Sonic who says all they have to do is watch the all-night show and they'll get them when they can. It's explained that the robot spare parts warehouse had been deserted when they returned, so they're able to disguise their friends as robots. They have the good sense to know that they could just sleep in the darkness at the back and don't actually have to watch the movies. Although they'd still hear them, I doubt they'd be able to fall asleep to them. They have to decline an oil change, and Johnny has to tuck Porker's tail into his metal shell on the way up the stairs. Maybe it was impossible to hide his tail with the robot parts they had. Why is Eggman so nice as to provide his robots with the theater? Wouldn't they just be working 24/7? The narration just has to explain that the metal cinema chairs provided for robots weren't comfortable. I don't understand. Did Eggman find it to be cheaper to use metal chairs than real cinema chairs? Well, he is known for getting metal and not soft stuff, so why not? Sonic drags Tails into the main street because it's in a hurry to get into the arcade, where he quickly gets distracted playing an arcade game where he uses a control pad to race an aquatic bike through water levels. I hate that the narration says it wasn't really a good game like, well, you know what. Why wouldn't the writer be allowed to advertise one of the Sonic games in a Sonic book? Why would he think he's not allowed to do that and not ask permission to? I'm glad Tails doesn't get the chance to lecture Sonic that he's wasting his time being easily distracted. And when Sonic gets the highest score, and it puts his name into the arcade machine, which could just panic any robots that see the score and cause them to try to alert Eggman, he gets a response from the console. It tells him to help and admits that it's Joe Sushi. It's convenient that he can choose to display a message other than the one he was programmed to display. Otherwise, Sonic would have had to steal all of the arcade machines one by one just in case, and that'd take forever. Sonic's smart enough to look around to make sure he wasn't about to get thrown out by a robot for this, and then detaches the console from its wall mountings just like that. Because it's so much easier to write him as also super strong instead of relying on someone who is. Sonic says there's also the matter of finding Eggman's master lab, even though they were already there, so they shouldn't have forgotten the way. Hell, he was there in Sonic 2 as well. He even remembers that it's in the center of the city. Tails reminds him that they haven't found Chirps yet, and there's some obvious humor and dramatic irony because Tails and Sonic both assume that Chirps is actually on a planet Kentucky, and not just the state of Kentucky. It makes sense that in a sci-fi fantasy world where anything can happen, they would believe this. Sonic calls Tails Buddy, and Igor explains that the shapeshifter had been upgraded so that it couldn't affect robots. Why wasn't that made the case a lot earlier? And depending on your definition of robots, that would mean Flicky and Joe too. A robot is anything that has an AI in it and can move. Even spelling out a message is good enough. But the last of the prototypes hadn't been upgraded because Edgar forgot to do that, even though he's a robot. And the narration gives away on purpose that this is going to help Sonic. How convenient that Edgar magically forgot to upgrade all of them. I just have to assume it's because he got distracted remembering Sally, since this is what happens to him in the scene right before he was told to begin the keying sequence for a countdown. And I know for a fact that if you get distracted thinking about something, you can forget if you already did something and assume you did. Sonic and Tails see a dark skyline in the distance and a green glow, and somehow it takes them a bit of chit-chat to recognize it as the transmogrification ray, even though they've seen it before. I only appreciate something like that being green because it's new. But really, it should be gray if it's only planned to turn people into robots. Somehow, they waste time talking in a panic before finally deciding to go get their friends and run back to that green light because it gives away where Eggman's lab is. Eggman wants to start the world robotization at a specific time tomorrow morning instead of right now for some reason, and is told that's impossible this early. He tells Eggman to make sure it's ready by that time or else he'll use him for scrap. Eggman smacks a fist into his hand, which crushes his egg snack. And Eggman starts getting angry, which makes no sense, and the narration even draws attention to why it doesn't. That he never got angry all of the other times Eggman had ranted at him like this. Eventually, Tails and Sonic in robot suits point out that getting into Eggman's lab logically shouldn't be easy. It turns out that Slicers can talk. And just like in Archie Sonic, I have to wonder why Eggman would go through the effort of giving them the ability to talk when their orders are so simple. The Slicer falls for Sonic and Tails' disguises. Tails tells Sonic to look at something in the building, and Sonic muffles his mouth and tells him to shut up. Thankfully, he says sorry for being rude right away. Hopefully this means he remembers the last time he said that to him and wants to be nice to him more often. He tells him he shouldn't use his real name in here. Why didn't they figure out fake names for each other earlier? Their organic voices would give away that they aren't robots anyways, because the Slicer used the voice synthesizer to talk to them. What if they don't sound enough like AI to fool any robots that are listening? And this was written in the 90s. The idea of AI-generated speech that doesn't sound stereotypically robotic wasn't considered yet. Tails points out chirps. They see a chicken in a small Egg-O-Matic wearing a shiny foil spacesuit. The fact that a chicken can fit into a spacesuit makes me picture him as looking like Chicken Little. Sonic's smart enough to know that they should walk slowly and deliberately to blend in. He could just kill all of the robots and get to chirps faster. To be fair, when they're in the business of trying to rescue somebody and turn it back to normal, it is responsible for them to make sure the whole building's not on high alert with endless waves of robots chasing them, because chirps might get hurt otherwise. Some lasers might get aimed at him from a room they'd be approaching. The dome gets opened, and Sonic tells Chirps he's here to save him. Why is Chirps not shapeshifted yet? He could have told him to use a codename for him and Tails the first time he started talking to him here and prevented him from almost saying Sonic. But it doesn't matter. Sonic says Chirps' spacesuit is kitchen foil, but Eggman cleverly told him a bunch of lies so he wouldn't run away. And the bag behind him is a bag of breadcrumbs and spices. Tails says there's a temperature dial on the outside of the supposed spaceship that's got oven settings. It turns out that Eggman was planning on making a meal out of it because he didn't lay eggs. It makes sense, because Chirps is a chicken, and Eggman's evil, and it's also a new idea. I love that it actually took advantage of the fact that Chirps is a chicken. It's a shame the Sonic series never took advantage enough of its character's species inspiration, and that if it started now, it might be called too silly and weird for an inherently unrealistic series. Even Family Guy does this better by having Brian act like a dog. It's always one of the funniest jokes in the show. Sonic calls him a thick chicken for having not already known Eggman was a hateful liar. And then the narration says he wished he hadn't been rude, and admits that it wasn't poor Chirps' fault that he had been in this predicament. So Sonic started out being worse than Fleetway Sonic, and then the writer softened him up because he felt bad about telling Tails to shut up. So it's OVA Sonic that's worse, because he never felt bad about that. And that's ironic, because he's from a Japanese continuity. But Sega Japan didn't stop that, even though the creator of Sonic worked on the OVA. Wish knew how much power Yuji Naka had over the OVA. Sonic tells Chirps he's really sorry, and says he has to destroy the slab. He says Flicky and Joe are stuffed inside the robot suits he and Tails are wearing. Chirps eventually gets told not to worry because he won't get eaten if they stop Eggman from it. But they can't take him with them now. After all, they can't run fast in these robot suits without giving their true identities away. And if Chirps was noticed as missing, the building would be put on high alert anyways. Sonic should have explained that. Eggor is seen as a waste of time. Why is a door in Eggman's base programmed to say "have a nice day" and "missing you already"? Sonic thinks the inventor of that is a dork. It's ironic that a hero would be against a door that tries to cheer people up. It couldn't have been made by Eggman. He's smart enough to tell Tails to look up, and they see a huge array of crushers above them. They get to the end of the corridor, and Sonic says, "I think these robot suits just saved our lives." I'm glad this happened to make it absolutely clear that Sonic was justified in using a disguise. Apparently, some people are so nitpicky, they think it's out of character for him to ever wear a disguise if he doesn't have to. Okay, he is cocky, so it's good that it turns out he did have to. So this is the kind of thing he thought about first. The story wastes some more time with padding, so it finally stops describing the world roboticizer that looks like a cylinder. Sonic somehow assumes he wouldn't be able to destroy it. He also somehow assumes that the minute it got touched, every robot in the building would be here within seconds. They're not that fast. It's so weird that Sonic would think before he acts. Tails should have made these assumptions and told him to wait. Then he'd follow his advice because he respects Tails. That's good writing. They turn around and look down the barrel of the portable roboticizer. Somehow Eggor says he has them surrounded, and Tails is brave enough to say he's wrong at a time like this somehow. Eggor says it's just something he saw in a video once because it's something they say when the good guys are captured. Sonic and Tails just stand there for some reason. To be fair, they'd have to take off their robot suits to do something cool, and they're not even allowed to move without getting shapeshifted. Eggor doesn't press the trigger. I still don't know how he was given such free will. He still makes a lot more sense than Snively because he's in a badnik. But a badnik shouldn't have free will. So it's just replacing one plot hole with another. Sonic yells, pretending that he's talking to Eggman, and tells him not to turn Eggor into scrap metal. So Eggor looks in the direction, giving Sonic the chance to hit Eggor full pelt. He drops the ray gun, but still squeezes the trigger, which causes the ray to bounce until it hits Eggor predictably. Surprisingly, it turns him into scrap metal. But in the middle of that mass of metal sat a red squirrel who can talk, explaining his obsession with Sally. So it literally was Gamma before Gamma. It never made any sense for Gamma either. Why is Eggman's programming so bad in that? Why is he able to delete his master registration? Anyways, I'm glad this means Eggor gets redemption instead of destroyed, because the real Eggor is the squirrel, who says he remembers that he used to live in trees and got captured in a net. And also can remember fragments of his life as a robot, but somehow can't piece them together. He somehow assumes he was one of Eggman's experiments with a shapeshifter ray, even though he was freed from a badnik, the remains of which are all over him. Somehow he can't remember his name, even though he remembers where he used to live. That's backwards. But it sure would have been useful to Surge. How does he have any memory loss? Granted, it was never explained animals don't get some memory loss from being put in a badnik for a while. So it's not a retcon, but it's common sense to assume they don't. Eggman would just give them full amnesia then, which you'd only do out of sadism. Tails has a good idea that Sonic should put Flicky down here too before trying to fire the reverse ray at Joe, because they don't know how much energy it has left. It turns them back to normal and breaks for no reason. The story skips past showing Sonic putting them in a capsule with Chirps, so for once it has some good pacing. But it would have been better to cut out worthless stuff while showing stuff that matters like that did. Sonic calls Tails buddy and says they were already taking a risk by sneaking them past the robot guards. He says they had to hide them somewhere, and this way they know where they are, and reassures them that they'll be safe. I don't think I ever saw Sonic say "like" before in the filler word sense. That's not the kind of slang he uses. Still way better than how he talks in Sonic Sunday strips and Sadie M though. It's much more likely to come off as natural because it's how most informal speech in English is done. Sonic wonders if Egor the squirrel is sure he wants to go with them. They had decided on calling him Egor because it's the name they know, even if he was reluctant to agree. Egor says he remembers the layout of the lab, and even some of the computer codes, and could even try to cut off the alarm systems. It's also explained that there wasn't enough room in Trip's capsule to hide Egor as well, and he had proved his worth to them by guiding them through small side passages that weren't lined with traps on the way to the control center. Sonic's only excuse for not being sure that bringing him along was good is overprotectiveness, because while he is reckless with himself, that doesn't extend to other people without special powers, because he's a hero. Egor types the correct numbers into an access panel. It says he typed in an extra number, but somehow the door is still open. It just also causes robots somewhere in the distance to start moving because of an investigative check putting the building on alert. Nothing creative happens. Sonic just runs and fights badniks in way too many words. Egor works at the keyboards, ducking to avoid wayward missiles, and tells them he cut off the alarm systems. He points behind them at the opening door with more robots behind it. It's cool that Sonic hits a Clucker robot and sends it crashing into another one. Bullets hit computers of Eggman's, making them outright explode. Sonic grabs a Clucker robot and swings it around to use it to blow apart other robots. That's awesome. He never did that before. The control center gets blue, smelly smoke rising to the ceiling, and electrical cables are sparking and moving around. And two of the machines start leaking oil. Egor tells them to get to the elevator with him. The elevator quickly stops, and Sonic authoritatively yells that they're not going to be stopped by an elevator with an attitude problem. Sonic jumps at the hatch on the top, which flies apart, and he fixes a jammed pulley and chain. I guess he learned how to do that from when Eggman used to be good and he worked for him. The elevator returns to normal and its doors open at basement level, and Sonic jumps back down into it. They head to the dome of the World Roboticizer. Egor starts looking around frantically, being shocked that he was still in one piece at this point. I love how relatable he is here. He feels like how a normal person would feel on an adventure with Sonic, but unlike with Antoine, he doesn't stop the pacing dead for minutes because he's afraid. Sonic jumps onto the World Roboticizer, and the story says that Sonic/Toaster was bouncing around striking the World Roboticizer. Only part of the time was Sonic shapeshifted into a toaster. That's confusing. Every time a character is shapeshifted in this book into this arbitrary, silly thing, it just reminds me of the Dark World from Link to the Past. And at least that explains that the form you took reflected your heart. There's no rhyme or reason for what anybody is turned into. Bits start breaking off of it. Eventually the dome opens, and into it flies a black Eggmobile of Eggman, who tries to fire missiles at Sonic, who narrowly avoids him by swerving in midair, and the missile hits the Roboticizer. One of its side rods snaps off and flies into the air from an explosion below it, and Sonic catches a ride on the rod. The rod flies towards Eggman, so Sonic lands behind him and starts pressing buttons in the Eggmobile, making it turn over and start to fly upside down as Sonic's holding on to it. Eggman's described as fat enough to jam himself safely into the cockpit seat, but his panicking struggles make things worse. And somehow he falls out of the cockpit anyways, despite being jammed into it a second ago. So that shouldn't have been described. He falls into the World Roboticizer and it turns him into a huge egg timer. I wonder how it knew what to turn him into. Egor did type a lot. Maybe Egor caused him to get turned into an egg timer. Otherwise it's like random nonsense. A satisfying and gutsy bit of karma regardless. I hope the UK books after this don't follow continuity. So this could just be a universe where Eggman was defeated. Sonic jumps out of the Egg-O-Matic and it crashes into huge doors across the chamber, making a big explosion rip apart a wall. Sonic talks in a bunch of slang celebrating its success when it isn't really the right time because they're in a dangerous place and still have to save Chirps. And the next chapter doesn't show them reunite with him and the friends they left at the movies. It knows that would be boring. But so is the stuff that didn't need to be in the book, and that was still there. It cuts to a party in Green Hill Zone. So the first cutscene of Generations wasn't entirely original. Cola and soda flowed in fizzy rivers. Cola is soda, and what a waste. It's explained what the people at the party are eating, and it's all normal snacks. And Sonic's impressed by how much of an appetite these people have. Sonic paranoidly assumes that Eggman has a way of saving himself from his own machine. He says his prototypes have a reverse function, and he figures that some robot's going to be able to return Eggman to his true form, even though they won't know that an egg timer was Eggman. So then if he can think that, why did he just leave him there? I hate that Sonic says that to rain on the parade. He could have pointed out that Eggman would have died by now because the room he was in had a bunch of fire and smoke pouring into it, and none of the robots they saw were interested in heading to the room. This book had Sonic strong enough to lift an arcade console onto his back and carry it really far. I'm pretty sure he'd be strong enough to do the same to Eggman and carry him somewhere where a robot couldn't go help him. And while I could understand him assuming that the cops wouldn't believe him that an egg timer's Eggman and thinking that's why I shouldn't bring him to jail, that's why I should have brought him to his house and dug a hole in the backyard and buried him there. Instead, he's perfectly happy to risk being personally responsible for everything Eggman would do after being revived. It sure seems like it because he's at a party instead of immediately rushing back to Eggman to make sure this doesn't happen to him, which he'd do if he's opposed to it. He shouldn't have been written to say this because it just draws attention to him being a bad hero here. He sure is lucky that everyone around him is too scared or stupid to point this out. You'd think since Tails is fine with trying to hurt Eggman no matter what, he'd insist on going back for him with a hammer or something. Sonic says, and talking of robots, before the narration says that he and Tails were miffed that Eggor turned out to be a handsome squirrel because it got Sally to stroke the fur on his forehead. I guess I'm saying talking of and not speaking of is UK slang, and him saying that reminded me of Jack from Archie saying once a robot, always a robot. It's shocking to see that attitude displayed by Sonic just because he's jealous of a rival for Sally's affection. And why is Tails miffed about it? He's too young. It must be because he's mad on Sonic's behalf. Sally pities Eggor for having amnesia, and Eggor says his name's Valentino. I guess he's lying to have a name that impresses her. He was sympathetic before. He says it was her who saved Mobius. At least she gets really excited about this instead of just confused like the other Sallys. He says she was the one who made him stop acting like a robot because he kept remembering her and looking at her on the monitors. She blushes and wonders how that saved the planet when he was clearly going to get to that. He says that he didn't activate the alarms when Sonic and Tails arrived because of her, and he was able to make sure the defenses of the machine got removed. At least he shows some humility by saying he's not a superhero. Sonic and Tails look childish by complaining about this conversation that Tails had walked over to eavesdrop on. They insist that they would have triumphed without his help, which is annoying, and I don't believe that when the same hedgehog said that his robot suit saved his life, and if Eggor had activated the alarm, then those crushers would have already been active. Who knows how Eggor saw through their disguises to decide not to activate the alarm? Maybe he had a perfect memory of what every robot that was supposed to be there looked like. Sally holds Eggor's hand and strokes his forehead and says he'd better stay with her. It's nice to see her be happy with somebody she actually gets along with all the time. He thanks her and says she's so kind and sweet. Sonic sees a girl appear over the horizon and smirks, hoping something interesting is gonna happen. He calls Tails little buddy. Sally gets thanked for giving Eggor some hazelnuts, and the front door to Sally's house gets kicked open by a female red squirrel with curlers in her hair and a frying pan, who says his real name is Kevin. How did she know to go to the birthday party? How did she know to be near it? I guess she just heard about it on the news. Surprisingly, the narration says some more of his past life seemed to be coming back to him. No wonder he'd run away from home. So it's not really about him being a bad person, because he actually didn't remember his girlfriend, who's an abusive psychopath. So it's not him cheating on her when he didn't remember her, as much as the demented narrative tries to frame it as such. Speaking of psychopaths, Sonic and Tails are mostly happy about seeing this. Did this writer watch AOSCH? Tails says serves him right, but at least the narration says he feels guilty. But it shouldn't be on the slightest bit. If he's like this, then he definitely has no reason not to go back to Eggman's lab with a shovel to try to destroy that egg timer. Because it's not about mercy. And it's not about him playing nice to humor Sonic. Then Sonic makes fun of Sally at a time like this by pretending he doesn't feel well and asking her to cool his fevered brow, which Sally would have felt when it came to Kevin. So she would have known if he was lying. Thankfully, the story ends with Sonic having to wipe the last of the soda off his sticky spines as he thinks that some people don't have a sense of humor. But anyone would hate being treated like that. I really don't see the value in this downer ending. That chapter should have been cut out by the editor. Sonic just jumped to the conclusion that Kevin was only taking advantage of Sally. But the whole story up to that point had made it clear that he did think she was cool. And clearly it would be better if he left that psychopath that Sonic should have called the cops on. I guess he doesn't have a cell phone because it's the 90s. It's a shame that Sonic went back to being awful at the end of the story, being way worse than Archie Sonic was to Jeffrey. Because Jeffrey at least always treated him like dirt, which actually justified him hating him. This Sonic's still a noticeably more selfish prankster who only took a level of kindness when it came to Tails, and people whose lives were in danger who weren't rivals for Sally. I have to assume the reason he still made fun of Sally then was that he resents her for not dating him. This was by Carl Sargent under a pseudonym, and was in theory about Sonic trying to save his friends from Eggman by running around levels from the games trying to find out where they are, but not having to defend himself from Eggman. Even though that'd be in character for Eggman. And then he has to try to find where Eggman is when he gets away. The excuse plot's uncreative, but that doesn't matter because it's really a whole collection of stories in the form of a story arc that are full of new ideas. Or at least new premises for stories. I won't list them all because interesting new idea is all I have to say about them. And take forever to explain everything that happened in the book. It's too bad its most common problem is being needlessly descriptive and wordy with words that aren't engaging. So there's a lot of boring parts. It had enough that was new for me to respect it though. Boring is objective, so whenever my only complaint with the creative story in the summary is that it's boring, it might still be a good story. It's well written for the most part. And it wouldn't be boring if it weren't a novel, because then it couldn't have most of that narration. So I don't think it'd be fair if I called it bad, essentially just for being a novel, which the writer had no control over. It's like saying a story in a comic is bad because it's not in motion. I'm trying to compensate for my being easily bored and thus biased against wordy books that constantly have me stop being engaged in them from it. So far, I would have found all of these Sonic books a bore if I weren't typing about them. The reason I didn't care enough to point out every time Sonic called Tails little is that despite not being an inventor, he's still Sonic's main friend who gets into the action right behind him the whole time. And he comes up with a lot of good ideas that get followed. So ultimately, he's still treated with respect. He's better portrayed than he is in Fleetway. I hate when he's stupid or mistreated by Sonic. But the writer couldn't have known any better, so it's best not to get too mad about it when this is the best he's been portrayed outside of Japan at the time. The fact that Eggman kidnapped some animals at the start was only interesting because it had Sonic actually be friends with all the named animals. And because this was the first time the audience was given a story with Sonic finding out that the animals are gone in real time. That just meant it had an excuse to stretch that out. It's too bad the book over-relies on OCs for new ideas, when every one of them was annoying. It's also weird that all of Sonic's friends had their own houses, and I had to assume they were adults for it to make sense.